Everyone in the neighborhood knew Gunny and Valor. You'd see them most mornings, an older man in a faded USMC ball cap, walking slow but steady, one hand resting gently on the sturdy back of a black Labrador in a red vest. There was something unshakable about them. Gunny carried himself with a kind of quiet dignity you didn't see often anymore. He didn't need to tell you he was a Marine. You could see it in the way he moved, the way he acknowledged people with a nod instead of words, and in the respectful space people naturally gave him. Valor, for his part, was no ordinary dog. You could tell that too, just by watching the way he moved, always alert, always focused, never distracted by squirrels or passing cars. He wasn't a pet. He was a partner. That day was like any other. The sun was bright, sky clear, birds loud but not annoying. Gunny was headed to his physical therapy appointment at a medical suite he'd been visiting for months. Same route, same destination. He'd survived tours in places most people only read about in dusty textbooks, jungles, deserts, war zones with names that made civilians blink. Now, in the twilight of his life, his battles were with arthritis, a battered hip, and the occasional nightmare that refused to fade. But with Valor beside him, even the worst days felt manageable. That's what service dogs like Valor are trained for, not just to pick up fallen keys or brace a man's weight when he stumbles, but to hold back the invisible tides of memory that try to drag veterans under when no one else can see it happening. Gunny didn't notice the police cruiser parked crooked in front of the building. He didn't have reason to. He and Valor walked the sidewalk like they always did, Gunny leaning gently into Valor's shoulder for balance, Valor scanning the path ahead, every step a seamless routine they'd practiced for years. But as they reached the front entrance, the calm started to shift. A voice barked out suddenly, sharp and unsteady. "Sir, control your animal." The words hung in the air like a slap. Standing just outside the door was a young police officer, maybe mid-20s, with a tight jaw and eyes too wide for the situation. His hand hovered near his sidearm before shifting to the taser on his belt. His stance was wrong, feet set, shoulders up, breathing fast. He wasn't just surprised, he was scared. Gunny saw it immediately. Trained eyes catch things like that. But what Gunny couldn't have known was that Officer Miller, fresh out of the academy, had a long-standing fear of dogs buried under his badge and bravado. Years ago, as a kid, he'd been bitten badly by a neighbor's German shepherd. That fear never got properly dealt with, just pushed aside, buried under procedure and paperwork. And now, it was resurfacing, fueled by adrenaline and poor judgment. Valor had done nothing wrong. He hadn't barked, hadn't lunged. All he did was let out a soft, low woof, a kind of canine heads-up that Gunny recognized immediately. It was how Valor signaled something unexpected, not a threat, just something new. Gunny gave a reassuring pat to Valor's back. "Easy, boy," he said under his breath. Then to the officer, he added calmly, "He's a service dog. We're just headed to an appointment, no need for alarm." But Miller wasn't listening. His body was still in fight or flight mode, and Valor's presence only seemed to dial it up further. "I said, step away from the animal." Miller's voice cracked slightly as his fingers twitched toward the taser grip. Gunny didn't raise his voice, didn't take a step forward. He simply said, "Officer, he's trained. You're scaring him. He's not a threat." But to someone already teetering on the edge of panic, logic sounds like defiance. Miller's brain wasn't processing what was being said. He was stuck on the image in front of him. Large dog, unknown man, uncertain intentions. Fear filled the gaps that training was supposed to cover. Gunny reached, slowly and deliberately, into his vest pocket, trying to pull out Valor's VA-issued service dog identification. He never got the chance to explain. What Miller saw was movement, a hand going somewhere, and his fear snapped into action. That was the moment the air changed, not because a threat had been made, but because a decision, fueled by panic, was about to light a fuse. In that split second, Officer Miller made a decision he would come to regret for the rest of his life. His training, his common sense, his duty to de-escalate, none of it mattered now. All he saw was a large dog beside a man who wasn't obeying his panicked commands fast enough. The slow, steady movement of Gunny reaching for his ID card felt threatening to him, even though it was neither sudden nor aggressive. The yellow and black VA tag, peeking from the wallet, never registered. What did register was fear, raw, blinding, and overwhelming, and that fear pulled the trigger. The sharp pop of the taser broke the silence. Two thin wires zipped through the air and landed square in Gunny's chest. In an instant, 50,000 volts coursed through his aging body. Muscles seized, his legs folded beneath him. There was no dramatic cry, no scream, just a grunt, low and guttural, as the weight of his frame hit the pavement hard. His hip, already compromised from years of wear, old fractures and battlefield trauma, took the brunt of the fall. The impact sent a fresh jolt of agony through his entire side, but Gunny didn't cry out. He was trained not to. Valor barked, just once. A sharp, shocked, heartbroken sound that cut through the static. He darted forward, not at the officer but toward his fallen handler, circling him, nuzzling his face, trying to understand what just happened. He let out a low, guttural whine, the kind of noise that rips at anyone who's ever loved a dog and knew they were trying to speak through the only sounds they had. His tail was rigid, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the man who had just hurt his human, his world. But still, no aggression, no charge, just a wall of protective instinct that made his frame stiffen between Gunny and the officer. Miller's hands trembled slightly, taser still pointed, unsure what to do next. There was no follow-up threat, no attack, just a groaning elderly man on the ground and a deeply loyal dog hovering beside him like a sentinel. Bystanders had begun to gather by now, people from inside the office building, from the sidewalk, from parked cars. Phones were up, recording. No one had missed what just happened, and no one could make sense of it. One minute it was a man walking his dog to a medical office, the next minute he was tased to the concrete. Gunny's mind fought to clear through the fog of electric pain. His body twitched involuntarily, the aftershocks of the taser leaving him dizzy and disoriented. He tried to speak, but his jaw was tight, voice garbled. His first thought wasn't about himself. It was Valor, always Valor. "Easy, boy. I'm okay," he forced out, more breath than sound. He reached a shaking hand to reassure his partner, his best friend, who now stood over him like a shield. Valor's warm tongue brushed his cheek, and Gunny felt the weight of his companion's concern. That alone gave him enough strength to reach again for his phone, fingers clumsy, coordination still scrambled. He didn't dial 911. He didn't need more of what had just arrived. Instead, he scrolled until he saw the name. CFA Actual. No one else, just that. It was a direct line, unofficial, quiet, and reserved for moments exactly like this one. Moments no veteran should ever have to face, but that every member of his old Marine recon unit had agreed would be answered without hesitation. He pressed the call. One ring. A calm, steady voice came through the line. No greeting, no pleasantries. "Location and sit rep, Gunny." It was Top Rodriguez, former first sergeant, the kind of Marine whose voice could cut through chaos like a scalpel. Gunny tried to sit up, failed, and simply muttered through clenched teeth. "Office building, corner of Oaken and 7th. Local cop lit me up. Misread Valor. Dog's good. I'm not. Took a bad hit. Officer panicked." There was a pause. Then Rodriguez's voice shifted, cold, focused, the voice of a man who had once led squads into war zones and never forgot what brotherhood meant. "Understood. Stay put. Help en route. 5 minutes or less. We're coming in hot." The line went dead. Gunny let the phone slide from his hand and closed his eyes. He wasn't sure what hot would look like in a civilian setting. But he knew Top. Knew what that promise meant. And he knew, without a doubt, that things were about to change. Not in hours, not tomorrow, now. Valor settled next to him, head low, eyes never leaving the officer, who had stepped back a few paces, taser still drawn, posture now more uncertain than aggressive. Miller's eyes darted to the growing crowd. He was beginning to realize that whatever threat he thought he saw wasn't there, and never had been. The silence was louder now than the taser's pop. Every eye was on him, not with curiosity, but with judgment. And far in the distance, faint but rising, there was a sound, not sirens, something heavier, more deliberate, a sound that Gunny hadn't heard in years but recognized immediately. Tactical vehicles, convoy, coming fast, coming for him. The sound began as a low rumble, distant but unmistakable to anyone who had ever served. It wasn't the high-pitched wail of emergency vehicles or the metallic clatter of police cruisers speeding through intersections. No, this was something heavier, deeper, a vibration that started in the soles of your feet and climbed up your spine like a forgotten memory. It was the sound of organized power in motion, of engines built for war zones and terrain no city planner ever considered. It was the sound of brothers answering a call. Officer Miller didn't recognize it at first. To him, it was just noise, something unfamiliar and annoying, competing with the pounding in his ears and the rising panic in his chest. He was still standing there, taser slack in one hand, the other now twitching nervously as his mind tried to catch up to what he had just done. He kept glancing around, hoping someone else would step in and explain it away, validate it, make it all stop feeling like the colossal mistake it was rapidly becoming. The older man groaning on the pavement didn't look dangerous anymore. In fact, he never had. The dog still hadn't moved toward him. The only thing the animal had done since the taser fired was stand between Gunny and the world, his brown eyes locked onto Miller like a silent accusation. Nearby, someone had started shouting, not at Gunny, at the officer. "He's a veteran! That's a service dog!" A woman's voice, angry and cutting through the stunned quiet like a blade. Others joined in, questions flying. "What is wrong with you? You didn't even give him a chance. He tried to show you his ID." A few phones remained in the air, capturing every second of it. The tension, the silence, the distant thunder getting closer. Miller tried to regain control of the situation, but his voice cracked when he spoke. "Everyone step back. Stay back. This is a police matter." But no one moved. No one believed him anymore. Gunny was still on the ground, the pain in his hip now throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat, but he was conscious, aware, and listening. He could hear Vala's soft breathing beside him, the subtle shift in the dog's body each time someone moved. But most of all, he could hear that rumble getting louder, and with it, something else stirred inside him, something old, something solid. It was the feeling of knowing he wasn't alone. Back at a military base years ago, they had a saying, "If you call, we come. No questions." That wasn't just a slogan, it was code, and Gunny had just invoked it by calling CFA actual. That line wasn't monitored by dispatchers or bureaucrats. It was a direct line into a network of men and women who had fought together, bled together, and made a silent oath to never let one of their own fall without an answer. Top Rodriguez was the embodiment of that code. Since leaving active duty, he'd built a private security firm, but more importantly, he'd maintained connections, real ones, tactical ones, the kind of connections that could reroute a convoy, deploy personnel, and mobilize gear at a moment's notice. And that's exactly what he'd done. 3.5 minutes after Gunny's call, the first military Humvee turned onto Oak Street from the north, tires gripping the asphalt with the kind of urgency that no ordinary vehicle ever displayed. A second vehicle followed close behind, then another. MR-APBs, tactical transports, a full convoy. They weren't flying lights or sirens, but they didn't need to. Their presence said everything. Desert tan paint, reinforced frames, and insignias that meant business. People on the street didn't know what to think. Was this an exercise, a drill, a national emergency? But to anyone who'd served, the message was clear. A Marine was down, and the Corps was here. Officer Miller turned to the noise just in time to see the front of the convoy roll up to the curb. His face lost what little color it had left. These weren't local law enforcement reinforcements. This wasn't backup from the station. This was something else entirely. The kind of thing no training scenario had ever prepared him for. The vehicles moved fast, but coordinated, strategic and deliberate. They weren't blocking the road, they were sealing it off. Within moments, the entire block was contained. A secure perimeter locked down the office building, the sidewalks, even the adjacent alley. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective, but it was absolute. From the lead MRAP, a side door hissed open and slammed downward into the pavement. Boots hit the ground, multiple sets. And leading them was a figure who immediately commanded the entire street. Colonel Matthews, clean-shaven, uniform immaculate, posture rigid with authority honed over decades of service. He didn't bark orders, he didn't need to. He simply moved, and others followed. 2 other Marines flanked him, a master gunnery sergeant and a captain. Their presence alone erased any notion that this was a misunderstanding or an overreaction. They approached Officer Miller without hesitation. The young officer took one small, instinctive step back, not out of fear, but because deep down he knew what he was seeing, the consequences, the weight, the chain of command reasserting itself in real time. And standing right in front of him was someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Colonel Matthews glanced once at Gunny on the pavement, Vala still beside him, before turning his eyes on Miller. When he finally spoke, the entire block seemed to go still. Even the wind paused. "I understand," he said. "You just deployed a taser on a decorated gunnery sergeant. One of my Marines, a veteran, injured in service to this country, accompanied by a registered VA service animal." There was no shouting, no threats, just facts, laid bare, heavy as granite. Miller opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He tried again. "The dog. It barked. I thought he was reaching for something." "You mean this?" Matthews interrupted, holding up the very ID Gunny had tried to show. It had been handed to him by one of the Marines who had already begun helping Gunny sit upright. "This is a federal identification tag issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs, recognized in every state, including this one, which you would know if you'd bothered to ask." Miller looked down at the ground, his world rapidly shrinking. The taser in his hand now felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Every word spoken by the colonel echoed in his ears, but the worst part wasn't what was said, it was what was coming next. Because Colonel Matthews hadn't arrived just to deliver a lecture. He had come to take charge. Oak Street, just moments before a quiet suburban stretch, had transformed into something few civilians had ever witnessed, and none would forget. The Marine convoy moved with surgical precision. These weren't siren-blaring cop cars or clumsy emergency responders fumbling with traffic cones. These were combat-trained professionals executing a silent, efficient lockdown of the area. They didn't need to shout to clear people back. Civilians instinctively stepped aside when they saw the uniforms, the gear, and the unmistakable discipline in how the Marines moved. No chaos, no confusion, just pure, focused execution of duty. They were calm, coordinated, and impossible to ignore, and they weren't asking for permission. Within seconds, both ends of Oak Street were blocked. Tactical vehicles parked across intersections at angles meant to absorb and deflect any vehicle foolish enough to try pushing through. Sidewalks were quickly flanked by Marines who posted up with their backs to Gunny's position, not to protect him from civilians, but to protect him from any further interference. Their eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, not hostile, but alert. Alert in the way only those who've walked into volatile places learn to be. Each one carried only a sidearm in accordance with stateside protocol, but they wore their presence like armor. The city's usual authority figures, local officers, building security, even the EMTs who had just arrived, stood back, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Most chose silence. Inside the circle, Gunny sat upright now, supported gently by 2 Marine medics who'd arrived with the convoy. They worked quickly but respectfully, checking his vitals, assessing the damage, talking softly to him as Valor rested his head in Gunny's lap, tail still, eyes watchful. The energy around them was reverent. No one rushed him. No one barked instructions. These were men and women who understood what it meant to treat one of their own. The civilians continued watching from behind the Marine perimeter, phones still recording, but voices now hushed. It wasn't just the spectacle of it all, it was the feeling that something serious had happened here, that whatever this older man represented, he mattered enough to bring this much force, this much attention, to bear. The ones who had first mocked or ignored Gunny now stood with wide eyes and heavy silence. Respect was being rewritten right in front of them. Meanwhile, Officer Miller remained rooted in place like a man stuck between dimensions, too overwhelmed to retreat, too shocked to react. The colonel hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a move, but somehow his presence dwarfed everything else around. His question still lingered in the air. Why had a trained veteran with a clearly marked service animal been tased instead of assisted? It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal of protocol, of decency, and of the very values that uniforms like Miller's were supposed to protect. Colonel Matthews turned his back on the young officer, not dismissively, but with a sort of practiced finality, as though nothing Miller could say at this point would alter the outcome. Instead, the colonel knelt beside Gunny, lowering himself slowly, a man who outranked nearly everyone present but didn't let rank interfere with humanity. "Gunny Raw," he said softly. "We got your call." Gunny's lips twitched with a weak smile, one corner lifting in a mixture of gratitude and irony. "Took you long enough," he murmured. Matthews chuckled under his breath. Just once. Traffic was hell. Behind them the convoy was still humming, some engines left running, their low idle blending with the ambient sounds of birds, wind, and the low murmur of the crowd. But inside that locked-down perimeter there was only stillness, respect, the kind you didn't ask for, the kind you earned. Matthews stood again, eyes sharpening as he turned back to face the scene. His voice, when he spoke next, had changed. It was no longer the warm familiarity shared with a fellow Marine. It was command, flat and absolute. "My medical team will handle Gunnery Sergeant Raw. His legal affairs, VA liaison and transport are now under Marine Corps supervision. That includes his service animal, who I remind you is certified, combat experienced and known personally to multiple units across the country. Officer," he said, now locking eyes with Miller again, "you will stand down, now." Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came. He looked for someone, anyone, to back him up. But none of the other officers who had arrived stepped forward. Not even the sergeant from his own precinct. They had all seen enough. What happened here wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a violation, and worse, it was captured from 6 different angles by people now uploading to social media in real time. Colonel Matthews turned away again, speaking now to the Master Gunnery Sergeant at his side. Confirm arrival time of the local police chief.
3 minutes out, came the reply.
Good. Let him see this with his own eyes. He didn't mean the convoy, he meant Gunny. On the pavement, with a bruised hip and an unshakable dog who hadn't left his side once. He meant the still active taser barbs that were now being carefully removed by a trained corpsman. He meant the ripple effects of a single moment of fear-fueled overreaction that had drawn the attention of the entire Marine Corps Brotherhood. Matthews looked around one last time, eyes scanning every uniform, every onlooker. "We don't leave our own behind," he said, not loudly but clearly. "And we sure as hell don't let them get tased on American soil without showing up to ask why." No one had a response. No one needed to. The silence that followed Colonel Matthews' last words was heavier than the noise that had preceded them. It wasn't just the lack of talking, it was the weight of consequence settling into the bones of every person present. You could feel it. This wasn't just about Gunny anymore, it was about something bigger, older and far more sacred, the promise Marines make to each other long after the uniform is folded, the medals shelved and the war stories left unfinished. It was about loyalty, accountability, brotherhood. And now that brotherhood had shown up, not metaphorically, not in spirit, but in steel, boots and unshakable purpose. The local police chief arrived just before the 5-minute mark, sirens off, tires squealing as his cruiser jerked to a stop just short of the Marine blockade. The man who stepped out wasn't someone looking to posture or defend his department. His face said everything before he even opened his mouth. He saw the MRAPs, the coordinated positions, the layered cordon, and then, most damning of all, he saw Gunny. Seated, supported by Marines, his dog Valor still faithfully at his side, and the taser wounds visible beneath a half-torn shirt. The chief's jaw tightened. No words could fix what he was looking at. Colonel Matthews approached him, walking with the slow, deliberate precision of someone who'd commanded operations under fire and wasn't about to be rushed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your officer deployed force against a disabled veteran, a decorated gunnery sergeant, with a clearly marked service dog, in public, in daylight, surrounded by witnesses, and he did it without cause, without escalation, and without requesting any form of identification before reacting." The chief swallowed hard. I understand the optics." "This is not about optics," Matthews snapped, cutting through the last of the excuses like a knife through canvas. "It's about failure, yours, his, your department's. Every officer in this city should know how to approach a veteran. Every officer should recognize a service dog, and every officer should damn well know better than to rely on fear instead of training." The chief's response didn't matter. He never got to finish whatever half-formed defense he was working on. Because right then and there, in front of civilians, Marines, and half the neighborhood now gathered behind the perimeter, Colonel Matthews turned and said clearly, "Officer Miller is relieved of duty, effective immediately. Badge, weapon, now." And without waiting, the police chief followed through. He walked over to Miller, whose hands trembled as he unholstered his sidearm and slowly removed the badge clipped to his chest. He handed them over, not to Matthews, but to his own superior. The message was clear. Control had shifted and the fallout had begun. There would be paperwork, yes, hearings, no doubt. But for today, for this moment, the Marine Corps had drawn a line and the city had stepped behind it. Meanwhile, Gunny was being transferred. Not in a city ambulance, not with handcuffs or citations or any of the indignities someone had briefly considered. No, he was moved gently onto a stretcher by Marine medics, his vitals monitored with calm precision. Valor never left his side. The dog was loaded into the transport vehicle next to him, muzzle resting on Gunny's arm, eyes watching everyone with unspoken authority. You didn't need to be a dog lover to feel it. That animal wasn't just trained, he was connected, to Gunny, to the Corps, to the gravity of everything that had unfolded. Inside the vehicle, a dedicated military transport with its own mobile med unit, Gunny was stable, but he wasn't quiet. He spoke with the medics, cracked a few tired jokes, grumbled about his hip. He asked about Valor, asked if Rodriguez had coordinated with the VA hospital, asked if someone had told his daughter not to worry. The answers came swiftly, calmly. Everything had already been handled. The Marine Corps hadn't just shown up in force, they'd shown up with a plan. That's what made them different. The convoy held its position until Gunny had been driven away. Only then, once the perimeter was satisfied, did the Marines begin to pull back. Quietly, professionally. No fanfare, no lingering for attention. They had come for one reason and one reason only. One of their own needed them, and now that he was safe, the mission was complete. But what they left behind, that stayed. The fallout spread fast. The video footage hit local news channels within the hour. By evening, national outlets had picked it up. Veteran tased, Marine Corps responds. Hashtags spread across platforms, debates raged, interviews were requested. The city issued a formal statement by nightfall. But statements weren't enough. They couldn't undo what happened. What did change, though, were policies. Within weeks, new training was rolled out, mandatory sessions on ADA compliance, service dog protocol, de-escalation with veterans, and PTSD-aware engagement. These weren't surface-level sessions. They were crafted with the input of active duty Marines, veterans advocates, VA specialists, and Colonel Matthews himself. It wasn't just performative reform. It was a full reckoning. As for Officer Miller, the internal investigation confirmed a troubling pattern. His file, already peppered with small red flags, couldn't survive this. He was dismissed formally. No pension, no ceremony, just a quiet exit shadowed by the weight of one reckless decision that spiraled into a national lesson. Gunny Raw made a full recovery, though the fall aggravated old injuries and left his hip sorer than usual. But he was no stranger to pain. What mattered to him wasn't the bruise or the headline. It was the reminder that when the system failed him, his brothers didn't. Valor received special recognition at the VA hospital where Gunny did his rehab, an honorary ribbon, a plaque, and enough treats to embarrass a kennel. But the real reward came from the calls, the letters, the hundreds, thousands of fellow veterans who reached out to say, "We saw, we heard, we won't forget." And Gunny, ever the stoic, responded to them all with simple words, "Semper Fi." Because when the world forgets who someone is, when age and time start to blur the medals and memories, it's brotherhood that holds the line. It's the pack that answers the call. And when that call comes from an old Marine sitting on the sidewalk beside his service dog, tasered by the very country he fought to protect, it doesn't go unanswered. Not then, not now, not ever.